Guys, this is Chef Grissom. One of my favorite things about pastry is chocolate. I love working with it. I love talking about it. It's really just such a great and versatile product that we can do a lot with. So I'm excited to talk to you guys about this stuff today. In this lecture, we're going to go from the bean to the bar, talking about growing chocolate, manufacturing chocolate, and then all the way out through tempering chocolate, the different methods of tempering chocolate, and finally working with a chocolate taste test. All right, the chocolate that we know and love comes from the cacao tree. So we see cacao, a lot of times you see it called cocoa, but the tree itself is called Theobroma cacao. And you can see on this picture here that the pods themselves grow from the trunks and the branches of this tree, and they kind of look like big, almost alien pods coming off of that. And the cacao bean is inside of this pod as the seed of this cacao tree. They only grow in tropical areas, so 20 degrees north and south of the equator. If we put that band around the globe, that's where you'll find the cacao trees growing. People have tried to propagate them outside of this 20-degree latitude band, but it has been unsuccessful thus far. Every now and again, you'll hear about a cacao plantation outside of here, but typically it doesn't last very long. They are very, very intolerant of temperature changes and different weather patterns, so we're very limited as far as where we can grow these trees. There's different varieties of cacao, just like there's different varieties of wine grape. So a lot of the things that we talk about with chocolate, they're also true for wine. So if we think about terroir, this is Terroir, the word there on the screen, we mostly hear about terroir when it comes to growing wine grapes. And what this is the characteristics of the area in which they're grown can change the characteristics of the grape, or in this case, the cacao bean. So if I have a type of chocolate or of cacao that I've grown successfully in this particular area for a long time, but suddenly someone puts a factory up, or it's a rainy year, or a very dry year, or there's a lot of pestilence, or there's anything that can happen in that area that changes the air, changes the soil, will affect that product. And we can actually get some taste carryover in the bean itself, just like we can get taste carryover in wine grapes. So the slope of the land, where they're grown, how much sun they get, any air pollutants, the type of soil they're grown in, all of those will affect the flavor of that bean. Because of this, very rarely do we get beans from only one region. So you can get single source beans, you're going to pay a lot more for them, and all of those different terroir characteristics are going to be very pronounced in that bean. Usually what chocolate manufacturers want to do is to develop chocolate blends that are standard from year to year to year. So like you'd have a wine, every year that vintage is going to be a little bit different than the year before. Chocolate manufacturers want to have a standard flavor. They want it to be consistent from year to year. So usually flavor profiles are created through blending the beans and sourcing them from different regions. Just like people buy coffees and people buy wines by going out to the vineyards and the coffee bean plantations and actually tasting those products, people buy chocolate the same way. So all of your big manufacturers, your Lintz and your Swiss Chalets and your Felklands and all of these different manufacturers will have dedicated people that go out to these different plantations, and they'll roast the beans and they'll grind them up, and they'll actually treat them a lot like coffee, where they'll brew them up and they'll taste for all the different underlying characteristics in each blend of chocolate, or each type of chocolate that's coming out, blend those together with all of the other ingredients that gets put into chocolate, which we'll talk about in a minute, and they'll create their own signature flavor blend. So very rarely will you get a single source, and if you do get a single source chocolate, expect it to be different year to year. These are kind of our boutique chocolates, just like boutique wines or specific vintage wines, versus the standard chocolates, which will be more like a table wine or something that's blended and it's going to taste the same year to year. So the type of chocolate that you get, or the type of cacao bean that you get, plus the region where it's grown, is going to determine the flavor characteristics that come through. Certainly each varietal of chocolate is going to taste a little bit different, and each region is going to impart that terroir. Okay, three types of cacao. We've got the Criollo bean, the Forastero bean, and the Trinitario bean. So the pictures here are of the Criollo and the Forastero. The Criollo is all the way on the left here. It's kind of a warty looking pod. It's a thinner pod. This is our finest type of chocolate. Forastero is more of a commodity bean. You can see it's grown in a couple of different sizes, and there's a few varietals of the Forastero bean. Okay, the Criollo pod is pictured here. It's generally light in color, grows off the trunk of the tree itself. It's a very thin shelled pod. So if we were to cut this open or even hold it and kind of squeeze it, it's going to be a little bit softer, and that skin on the outside is going to be fairly thin versus the Trinitario or the Forastero bean. When we cut it open, inside it almost looks like an ear of corn, the way that the cacao beans are growing inside this pod. So we can open them up, and the beans themselves are going to be very large and plump. They can be white to even a light purpley color inside, but when you smell them, they're going to smell very fragrant, okay, kind of a sweet, fragrant smell, not quite as grassy as some of the other beans. They're very high in fat, so they're used in the finest chocolate out there. Very, very prone to damage from disease, so they're very temperamental. Usually when cacao crops get wiped out, it's going to be this Criollo crop. So little blights and things that affect these beans will affect the Criollo most of all because they are so thin, which makes them very easy to damage. So only about 10% of the world's harvest comes from the Criollo bean. And you can buy chocolates that are only Criollo. You are going to pay a lot for them. So keep that in mind. Usually they're blended and Criollo beans are added in for flavor. The Forastero bean, you can see here, significantly darker in color. It's a rounder pod. If we were to squeeze this, it would feel a lot firmer because it's a woodier outside layer, which makes it less prone to disease. Diseases can't quite get in that pod as much as they can in the Criollo one. The beans inside, again, they look kind of like corn on the cob, a little bit bigger, and they're going to be flatter, not quite as plump as the Criollo bean, and they're going to be slightly different color. They can be heliotrope color, which is kind of a light purpley color, to a darker purple bean inside. They're going to smell a lot grassier. So when you cut open this Forastero bean and you smell it, it almost smells like fresh cut grass versus the kind of sweet, sugary, kind of floral aroma coming out of the Criollo bean. The reason we use this more often is because it's less prone to disease. So this is our commodity bean. It's really about 70% of the world's harvest comes out of the Forastero bean. So your cheaper chocolates are going to be all Forastero versus your very, very expensive boutique chocolates, which may be mostly or all Criollo beans. But usually most of the chocolate comes from this, and then we blend in a few of the flavor beans just to kind of pull out the flavor profile that we want. Okay, the Trinitario bean is a cross between Criollo and Forastero. So when we open them up, and you can kind of see the bottom opened up there in the Trinitario bean, it's going to have some traits of the Criollo and some traits of the Forastero. The nice thing about the Trinitario is that it's less resistant, or it's more resistant to disease than the Criollo bean. So it's got that kind of woody, thick pulp or thick pod on the outside that you can see. But it's got some of the sweetness and some of the flavor profile of the Criollo bean. As of right now, only about 20% of the world's harvest is the Trinitario bean. It's a fairly new propagation of bean. It is still somewhat susceptible to the diseases of the Criollo bean, but we're able to get a little bit more flavor out of this one than we do with the Forastero bean. Okay, as far as which one is best, it really depends. The easy answer would be to say that the Criollo bean is best because it's the more fragrant, the more floral, the higher in fat, it has the best characteristics. But depending where that bean is grown, that's not always true. So if you think about it like wine, if there's a very, very bad year in a specific area, if it's been very rainy or very dry, or a new industrial plant has opened up nearby, what could have been the best bean last year could be the worst bean this year. So it's very important that all of these companies have the dedicated tasters that go out and they determine the characteristics of each bean, and typically flavors come about through blending. So the bulk beans will be sourced from all over the world. You'll find some in Ghana, you'll find some in the Ivory Coast, you'll find some in Costa Rica, anywhere in that nice band of 20 degrees above or below the equator, we can grow those beans and they're all going to be just a little different. And then we add about 5% flavor beans to those in order to pull out the flavors that certain manufacturers want, which is why I can go to the grocery store, or I can go to even a boutique type store, or a chocolate manufacturer, and I can get chocolates that look very similar and they all taste very, very different. Even though it's just a 72% dark chocolate, I can have four different companies that are making the 72% dark chocolate, and every one will taste a little bit different. Okay, this is because those different flavor beans are being added and they're looking for a different flavor profile in their chocolates. When cacao is harvested, here you can see them opening up the cacao bean. This is a criollo bean. So when they're opening that up, you can see those nice big wide pods that are the big seeds inside that pod there. It kind of looks like a corn cob. All harvesting is still done by hand. So it's very, very labor intensive to get this cacao from the trees to the manufacturing processes or the manufacturing facilities. It has to be done by hand because the trees are fairly small and they're producing pods all year. So if we were to go out with machinery and start shaking the pods off the trees, you'll get ripe pods as well as unripe pods, and it'll damage those trees, which are fairly small and they're budding from their trunks. So workers will go out by hand and they carry these little hooked looking knives and they'll climb up around the trees. They're not very tall. And they'll snip off the ripe cacao pods. Each one contains between 20 and 50 beans. And while that sounds like a lot, it takes approximately 400 beans for 1 pound of chocolate. So keep all of this in mind when we're thinking about how expensive fine chocolates are. All of this is still being done by hand today. After the beans are harvested, they must be fermented in order to have flavor. This is the difference between grape juice and wine. If anyone has ever been out to wine country in Napa or in a different country and you visit a vineyard and they'll let you taste the grape, whether it's a Merlot grape or a Chardonnay grape or a Zinfandel grape, the grape itself tastes horrible. It tastes nothing like the wine that comes from it. So just like the grape has a completely different flavor from the wine, cacao beans have completely different flavors from the chocolate that it's going to produce later. So we have to let it go through the process of fermentation in order to create that flavor in the finished bean to create the flavor in the chocolate. Now, the beans have natural yeast on them, so we all know that fermentation is a result of the life cycle of yeast, or is the life cycle of yeast. So what the workers will do is they'll harvest the cacao, they'll take it out of the pod, they'll have all of those wet beans, and they'll lay them out either on mats here that you can kind of see raised up off the ground, or just right under banana leaves. And they'll cover those, keep it dark and moist, and let that yeast go to work, creating flavor, eating some of the residual sugar, and fermenting that bean. After they're fermented, they're spread out on racks like this to dry. So what you see in the picture is actually beans that are being dried. And the worker is there with a big rake and he's turning those beans over to dry them out in the sun. And it lasts about 5 to 7 days, and the major purpose of drying out these beans is to stop the fermentation process. If we were to allow them to continue to ferment, we would develop some very, very off flavors. It wouldn't give you the nice chocolatey flavor you're looking for. You'd get more of a rotting flavor, okay? Because eventually that fungus will just take over. So there's a couple ways to dry things. As they're doing up there on the picture, this guy is turning them over in the sun. This is a natural drying process. This gives you the nicer, cleaner flavor in your bean. The second way to do it is to light fires around it, heat it up and blow the smoke over the beans. Now, as you can imagine, that's going to impart some flavor in those beans. You're going to get a smoky flavor, and if you ever get a single sourced chocolate, you can actually tell by tasting it whether those beans were dried naturally or by being smoked. As they're drying, they lose almost all of their moisture. So they go from being those nice, big, kind of, puffy looking wet beans to only 8% moisture. They shrivel up like little dried raisins almost, but they're that hard kernel of seed underneath. So about half their weight is the moisture that they lose, and now they're a nice, hard, dry bean. At this point, they're bagged up and they're sent off to manufacturing facilities. Here you can see them being received at a manufacturing facility. At that point, just like any other bean, they need to wash, sort, and blend these beans. So based on the specifications of the chocolate manufacturer, these beans are going to come in and be blended in these big vats in order to develop the flavor profile. After they're blended, just like coffee, they go through a roasting process. So if this looks familiar, this kind of big barrel roaster here, you've probably seen it roasting coffee before because it's very, very similar. So you can see the cacao beans coming out of this, and as it's turning, it's just roasting these beans. Depending on the flavor profile, you can have a significantly different roast time. So if we want a light roast on our beans, we can go as low as 20 minutes. If we want a deep, dark roast on the beans, just like a dark roast coffee, we can go up to 2 hours. And what this roasting does is it cooks that bean and it concentrates that flavor. So now we're getting that really nutty, dark, bitter flavor coming out of that bean. At this point, we can crack up these roasted beans and we've got what's called a cocoa nib. Cocoa nibs are just the whole bean with the shell taken off. You can kind of see a little bit of the shell on the outside of the beans here, and then it's just cracked up and ground up into little small particles. Now we can add an alkali to that cocoa nib to get a Dutch processed nib, and that draws out a little of the fat in that nib. Sometimes we'll roast the nibs a second time if we're using them straight on something. Every now and again you see things decorated with cocoa nibs, which are just ground up cacao beans. Here you can see a picture of these nibs after they've come out of the roasting process. When they're done there, we have our cocoa nibs. We start micronizing and winnowing these nibs. Now micronizing, as the name suggests, is just breaking those pieces down smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. As they break down, the shell that's on the outside, it's a lot like a regular bean where you can crush it and there's that little shell, that little membrane that kind of sticks to the bean. When they're micronizing it, the shells come off all the way. After the shells separate, they winnow just like grain is winnowed or rice is winnowed, where it's kind of thrown up in the air or passed through sieves, and the shells are much lighter than the grain itself. The grains fall and the shells kind of go off to the side. So the way they do this in the chocolate manufacturing process is they have sieves and different airflows. They're blowing these shells off because they're very light, and the shells all go one way and the nibs all go the other. The final process must not contain more than 1.75% shell before it goes on to being pulverized. After it's all been winnowed, we've taken all the shells off, we've got it down to kind of a paste, we create something called a cocoa liquor out of these nibs. Now, even though it's called cocoa liquor, it contains no alcohol. So very important to realize that. And here you can see a nice liquid cocoa liquor coming out. And all it is the cocoa nibs ground up, ground up, ground up, ground up, ground up, and it makes this liquid kind of paste that contains nothing but cacao. Okay. At this point, they can press it and separate out cocoa butter, which is the fat in the cacao, from the cocoa powder, which is the cocoa solid. We can treat it with an alkali to create something called a Dutch processed cocoa powder. You get a little bit more fat out of it by doing that, and then you have Dutch processed cocoa powder on the other side of that. Or we can take this cocoa liquor, solidify it by tempering it, by arranging the crystal structure of that fat, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute, and sell it off as pure unsweetened chocolate. Now, if you've never tasted unsweetened chocolate, you might be looking at this saying it looks delicious. If you do taste it, it's very, very bitter. Chocolate in and of itself is very bitter. So of course, when people first started eating chocolate, they didn't eat it like we eat it today. They ground it up and they brewed it like coffee. It has a similar bitterness to coffee, and it was typically mixed with hot peppers, cayenne peppers, and drank as a liquid. It was supposed to be a very fortifying liquid, but it's not the same chocolate that we think about eating today. Most of what we eat today is sugar. So when we taste cocoa liquor in and of itself, expect it to be very, very bitter, but it has all of those floral undertones, all of those earthy undertones that we get in our finished chocolate product after it's been mixed. Okay, after we create our cocoa liquor, we start mixing that product into the chocolate that we know and love. So we blend all of our ingredients together and it comes out to about the consistency of a light dough. So we start with our cocoa liquor, which we just created in the last process, which is just ground up cocoa nibs that go all the way down to almost a liquid paste. Mix in sugar, milk solids, and butter fat if we're making a milk chocolate. Usually extra cocoa butter is added to make it flow a little bit better, make it a better product. Soy lecithin. Now we know soy lecithin as an emulsifier, but in chocolate we add approximately 0.3% to the chocolate to improve the viscosity of it. Otherwise it tends to be very, very liquid. Flavors are added to our chocolate, whether they're vanillin, which is usually added to every chocolate, or we can add in all types of different flavors. If you just go to the store now and see how many different flavors are added in, this is where they're added in this process. Okay, we blend our chocolates. Chocolate percentages, we see a lot of different percentages out there, and this doesn't mean it's a better chocolate at a higher percentage and a worse chocolate at a lower percentage. I know a lot of people make that mistake. They said, oh, I got this wonderful chocolate. It's 99%. That means it's got to be really good. And they taste it and it's extraordinarily bitter. What that percentage is the amount of cocoa mass in the chocolate. But more than the cocoa mass, which is just that chocolate liquor or cocoa solids, more than that, it's any part of that chocolate that's derived from the Theobroma cacao tree. So people like to say that white chocolate isn't chocolate because it doesn't have any cocoa mass in it. And it doesn't. It doesn't have any of those cocoa solids, but it does have cocoa butter. So if it has cocoa butter in it and it came from the Theobroma cacao tree, it is still chocolate. So a lot of our white chocolates will be at 20%, even though they don't have anything that makes them look like chocolate in there. Okay, so when we're looking at those percentages, keep in mind that they don't differentiate between the cocoa liquor or cocoa mass and the cocoa butter. So you could conceivably have a very high percentage chocolate that's a very light taste because so much of that percentage is the extra cocoa butter added to it, which doesn't really have a flavor of its own. Typically speaking, the higher the percentage, the darker and bolder and more bitter that chocolate, the smaller the percentage, the milkier and sweeter the chocolate, because so much more of what's in that bar is not actually chocolate. It's sugar, it's milk solids, it's flavorings, and all of the other things that go into making that bar of chocolate. So it indicates absolutely nothing about the quality of that chocolate, although you can take some cues from that number as far as what the flavor of the chocolate is going to be. If you give somebody a 99% chocolate thinking it's going to be really good, I hope they like bitter things because it's going to be so bitter you probably won't be able to eat it. Okay, so a dark chocolate is going to be down in the 60 to 70 range. You know, ultra darks or bittersweet chocolates are going to be 70 to 80 range. Milk chocolates are going to be in the 30 to 40 range. And of course, white chocolates can be all the way down to 20%. If the white chocolate does not have any cocoa butter in it at all, obviously it can't be called chocolate. So if it says white chocolate flavored candy coating, that's not chocolate at all. So it doesn't have anything in there, it's 0%. Also, what those numbers mean, the lower percentage chocolates have to be handled at different temperatures. Okay, so they have to be handled more gently. The extra butter fats in there slow the crystallization process of the cocoa butter, which we're going to talk about in tempering, and we can't heat them as high. They burn and they break down. So it's very easy to scorch a low percentage chocolate like a milk chocolate or a white chocolate versus a higher percentage chocolate like your darks and your bittersweet chocolates. The higher percentage also have more cocoa butter in them and less things to inhibit that cocoa butter, so they're significantly easier to temper. So our low percentage chocolates, our white chocolate and our milk chocolate, are typically heated 5 degrees cooler than our dark chocolates, and that's 5 degrees Celsius. Okay. After they're all blended, the chocolate goes through a refining process. So these big rollers here just roll it over and over and over, and it crushes the particle size. So the more times the number is, or the more times the chocolate is refined and crushed, the smoother it's going to feel in your mouth. This is why things like Swiss chocolate and German chocolates taste very, very smooth and very thick and rich and milky, where when we go to Walmart and get the dollar Easter bunnies, um, they're going to taste gritty and they're going to be grainy. A lot of it's because the sugar crystals aren't micronized, they aren't very, very small, and the chocolate itself has not gone through this long refining process. The longer the chocolate gets processed, the smoother it is, but also the more expensive it is. So don't be surprised if you're paying $1 for an Easter bunny that the chocolate's going to be gritty and grainy and not taste very good. So the particle ranges, the lower quality chocolates, they can be as big as 40 microns. 40 microns you can definitely feel as feeling grainy in your mouth. The better quality chocolates are going to be under 20 microns. So 25 microns, they say, is the limit as far as what you can feel in your mouth about it being gritty or not. 40 microns certainly is going to taste very, very gritty as you're eating that. After the chocolate is refined, it goes through a process called conching. Now, conching is a pretty cool thing. It was developed in Switzerland, and the reason it's called conching is because the original machines looked like a big conch shell. It should be called conching, I know, but they call it conching. And if you think about a conch shell, what they look like, they would put the chocolate inside of the shell and they would move it back and forth with a heated wand, like a big paddle, moving the chocolate in and out of this conch shell, or a machine that looked like a conch shell. And it would heat the product up and it would smooth it out and it would let a lot of the acids actually dissipate from the chocolate. So it gave us a much smoother product, a less acidic product, and all of the little particles of chocolate, even though they were under 25 microns, were able to be coated fully with this cocoa butter, and it allows it to just feel much more smooth in the mouth. So it really revolutionized the way that chocolate is tasted. It revolutionized the way that chocolate is prepared. It can go between 3 and 96 hours in these machines, and now they don't look like conch shells very much anymore. They just look like large vats, and if you can see the picture, these little wands that go down in it are going in kind of a spiral motion, and they're heated, and they're just gently moving this chocolate around, allowing the acids to dissipate and allowing everything to be covered with the cocoa butter, and it smooths out the finished product. But longer isn't always better. Just like the criollo isn't always the best cocoa bean, longer conching isn't always better. This is where the professionals have to come in, evaluate the chocolate, see how acidic it is, because remember, it's going to change from year to year and from season to season where they're growing and the terroir and all that of the chocolate. It's an agricultural product. It's not going to be the same all the time. So the conching, they really have to take into account all of the different varieties of chocolate and how they were grown and how they were blended and the acidity levels to determine what's the right amount of time for conching. As it's going, the moisture is evaporating out, so it kind of dries this product out a little bit and just creates a wonderfully smooth, lower acid finished chocolate. Okay, after the chocolate is conched, it goes into a tempering machine. It's tempered and molded. Now, we're going to be doing this by hand here in class. Typically, the chocolate manufacturers will have large tempering machines. Now, when I say tempering, let's kind of get away from the temperature thought. A lot of people think that tempering is just moving chocolate through a temperature range to make it hard or make it strong. And while that's true, we need to also think about what's going on in the chocolate. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit. So really, by saying tempering, a better term for this would be pre-crystallizing this chocolate. We need to build crystals inside this product and allow it to crystallize fully. So if chocolate is not tempered, it's not strong and it's not smooth and it'll bloom, which we'll talk about here in a minute. We need to make it a stable product so that we can melt it and pour it into bars, or we can make pastels, or all the different forms that chocolate is sent to us. If it falls out of temper or it wasn't tempered originally, it can be at room temperature and be liquid or be sticky. So we need to make sure it undergoes this process. So the process in its simplest form is heating the chocolate, cooling it down, and heating it again. So it creates a crystal structure in this chocolate that's stable and that won't melt at room temperature. It's molded into all types of different products for sale, whether it's a chocolate bar, whether we're dipping this product, whether we're molding it into a showpiece, making candies, or just piping them out into pastels so that we can sell them as a B2B manufacturer. So somebody else will be creating something with them. All right, so chocolate tempering is better known as pre-crystallizing because we're creating a crystal structure in this chocolate. So let's back up on chocolate just for a second and think about what's in that chocolate. We've got the cocoa solids in there, and we've also got cocoa butter. Okay, cocoa butter is the fat that's in the chocolate. We've got sugars, we've got milk solids, sometimes we've got flavors, we've got lecithin. All these things are coming together. The only part of that chocolate that changes form is the cocoa butter. So cocoa butter is what we call polymorphic, which means it takes multiple different forms. And cocoa butter takes 6 forms. The forms of cocoa butter crystals here, we're just going to call them form 1 through 6, but they can also be called alpha, beta, and gamma crystals. Now, gamma crystals are the first form. They're very, very small. They're not stable. They don't hold everything into emulsion. They're going to be liquid at room temperature. Even by room temperature, they're usually melted out. So we don't have to worry too much about gamma forms. Alpha forms, kind of the same. They're going to be very, very liquid at room temperature. And then they melt out very, very early. The ones we need to worry about are beta prime crystals and beta crystals. So what we're looking for is a beta 2 or a beta 1 crystal. These two crystals, they're also called form 5 and form 6, are the only crystals that are stable at room temperature. So we want to encourage this particular type of crystal growth. Now beta 5 is the only one that we can accomplish in one day. Beta 6 crystals, they take months to form, so a beta 5 can actually turn into a beta 6. Or we can do something called solid to solid tempering, where we introduce beta 6 crystals into our chocolate and it will form those. Typically when we're tabletop tempering or tempering in one day by hand, we're looking for that beta 5 crystal. If we get everything aligned in a beta 5, we'll be able to hold the chocolate without it melting in our hand. You can see here they're snapping that chocolate. It's strong. It doesn't bloom. It keeps a nice appearance, and it does what we need it to do. Now how we do this is we encourage crystals to form in different temperature zones. So tempering does have to do with temperature, but it also has to do with time and agitation. Okay, so we say TAT are the 3 things that we need for tempering: time, agitation, and temperature. So when we look at the temperature part, each crystal melts at a different temperature. So form 1 crystals melt at 64 degrees Fahrenheit. So we really don't have to worry about those too much. Form 2 crystals melt out at 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Form 3 at 79, Form 4 at 84, Form 5 at 94, and Form 6 at 97. Okay, so if we overheat our chocolate, we're melting out these crystal forms. Now we want to overheat it past Form 4. We don't want forms 1, 2, 3, or 4 in our chocolate because they're not stable. We want form 5. But if we heat that chocolate past 94 degrees Fahrenheit, we've now melted out all of our form 5. If we heat it a few more degrees higher, we've now melted out all of our form 6 as well. Okay, now chocolate is going to take whichever form is most convenient for it at the time. So in order to get a strong, stable chocolate, we really have to work to make sure it forms that form 5 crystal. Okay, so controlling the temperature promotes or discourages crystal formation. If we keep chocolate warm but not too warm, we can promote the growth of the type of crystal that we want, which is the form 5. So when we change those temperatures, basically what we're doing is we're weeding out the unstable crystals. So let's think about seeding your lawn. If you've ever seeded a lawn, typically what you do is you prepare the ground and you till it all up and you get as much of the junk out of there that you don't want. Weed everything out so you've got pretty much virgin ground ready to take the seed. Then you can throw out grass seed, right? Throw it all out on the lawn, see what takes. As it starts coming up, you're going to throw out some weed and feed. And the weed and feed will feed the grass seed that you want and kill the weeds that you don't want. It's kind of like that when we're tempering chocolate. So what we do is we heat the chocolate all the way up until all of the crystals are melted out, just like you would till up your ground and pull out all the plants. Then we give it the crystals that you want. Okay, start building those crystals in there. As they start to form, then we have to go, using temperature, weed out all the ones that we don't want, because we know what temperature they melt at. So we have to heat it above that temperature, but not above the temperature that would weed out the ones we do want, okay, which is 94 degrees. 90 degrees is safer. So 90 degrees is really your magic number when it comes to dark chocolate. So all of these numbers are dealing with dark chocolate. So we've got to seed it with the correct crystal formation and then weed out all the ones we don't want in order to promote the growth of that crystal and temper the chocolate effectively. Okay, here's the temperature curve, and I'll have a graph for you guys as we continue on for the class just so you can see it visually. Okay, but in the first zone, or the first thing we do, imagine a line that kind of goes up at a nice sharp angle from room temperature, or maybe 70 degrees, up to 124 degrees with our dark chocolate. So we're going to take our chocolate and we're going to very gently heat that up to 124 degrees in our first zone of heating. What this does is it weeds out every single crystal that we have. So there is zero crystal formation going on in this chocolate at all. We've made it now amorphic. It has no crystal structure at all. If we were to stop right here and just let it cool on its own and let it set back up, it's going to take on all the different forms that it wants to. Okay, anything that it can form in it will, and the chocolate will be very unstable. This is why when you leave a chocolate bar on the seat of your car and you go out and it's been very hot and the chocolate melts, so you think, oh, I'm just going to throw that back in the fridge and it'll be fine. We'll throw it in the fridge and all of a sudden it looks waxy or powdery, or it looks moldy, where it's got these lines of this white going through it. That doesn't mean the chocolate is bad. That just means that it took on multiple crystal forms. So all of the fats are coming out of that chocolate and solidifying on the surface, or it could be sugar if it was humidity. We're going to talk about bloom in a little while. So the first zone, we melt out all the crystal butter forms, leaving it completely amorphous. There's no form at all. So the next form, or the next zones, okay, so 2 through 4, as that is coming down, we're going to start taking that temperature and dropping it. And there's a couple different ways we can do this. Usually we pour it out on a marble slab and we agitate it back and forth, and that marble will slowly cool down the chocolate, and we can add it back to the warm chocolate and it'll heat it back up and try to keep lumps from forming, and back and forth, and you'll see this demonstrated, so it'll make a little bit more sense. So in zone 2, as it's coming down in temperature, it's still too hot for those to form. So imagine that line now coming at not quite as sharp an angle down. Zone 3, form 5 crystals are created as it's coming down, 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 and we're agitating this chocolate back and forth. It's getting a little bit thicker. It's going to start going from a liquid chocolate to kind of almost looking like chocolate pudding on the table. And we're moving it back and forth, very gently creating these crystals. Now the chocolate is still very warm, so form 1 through 4 are not able to form yet. They're still melted out. So as we're agitating this and cooling it down, form 5 crystals are being created. But remember, we need TAT, right? Time, temperature, and agitation. It's got to have residence time. So we take this chocolate, put it back in the bowl, stir it up. It hasn't had enough time to crystallize the entire bowl of chocolate. It's almost like it's got some peer pressure going on. So little crystals are jumping in the bowl saying, hey, you want to be a crystal too? We need to have a little bit of time to allow that influence to get through the entire bowl. Pretty soon everybody will be a form 5 crystal and everybody will be good. As it's coming down and we're giving it residence time, we're also cooling that chocolate down. So in zone 4, as that temperature curve is coming down, 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 it's allowing for the residence time of form 5, but it's also allowing form 4 crystals to form in that bowl. So we don't want form 4 crystals, but we have to have enough residence time for form 5 to convince the rest of the chocolate it wants to be form 5 too. So now we've got this kind of little battle going on in our bowl where form 4 is forming and form 5 is also forming. Form 4 is going to be unstable. Form 5 is stable. So now we have to go into zone 5 where we re-warm that chocolate and melt out the unstable form 4 crystals. So this is like putting our weed and feed out on our lawn. We have to get rid of all the stuff we don't want. So we re-warm it, take it to 90 degrees, and we hold it at 90 degrees, and we allow that form 5 crystal to crystallize the entire bowl. So if we put actual numbers to these zones, zone 1 goes from room temperature up to 124 degrees. Zone 2 goes from 124 degrees down, 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 fairly gently, giving it plenty of time to cool down to 81 to 83 degrees. Okay, right in there. Now there's a temperature range because what we're really looking for is thickening. As the chocolate is thickening, it's going to get to like the consistency of pudding. At that point, even if we're at 83, 84 degrees, we're ready to rewarm it because we can over crystallize that chocolate very easily. So the bottom of zone 4 is that 81 to 83 degrees where our chocolate is getting nice and thick. Zone 5 takes it from 81 to 83 degrees very gently back up to 90 degrees where it's weeding that out. And then where it says zone 4, it should be zone 6. Zone 6 is going to hold that between 86 and 90 degrees to keep those form 4 crystals from forming, but promote the crystallization of form 5 crystals. All right, so a couple different ways we get there. The most kind of time-honored traditional way is tabling our chocolate, and that's what I was describing earlier. So to table chocolate, we heat the entire bowl of chocolate up to 124 degrees, and we pour about 2/3 of it out onto a marble table. So we move it back and forth on that marble table, and we cool it down until it starts to thicken, and we put it back in the bowl where the other third of melted chocolate is hanging out. Stir, stir, stir. Now you're putting this cooled chocolate in with very warm chocolate. It's going to raise the temperature of it. Stir, stir, stir until we get down to about that 81 to 83 for white chocolates and milk chocolates. We can get down to about 78, and we're looking for that thickening. We'll have to go back to the table usually once, sometimes twice, but put less out each time. Each time we go to the table and we're cooling it, we're thickening that chocolate, and as we add it back, if it's over thickened on the table or we poured too much out, it can create lumps in our bowl of chocolate, and we don't want to do that. So a little bit at a time, move it, move it, move it. As it starts to thicken up, we put it back in the bowl, we stir very gently. Now, what we don't want to do is pour it all out on the table, get it down to 81 degrees very quickly, put it back in the bowl, and think it's going to be done. Because we've changed the temperature and we've given it agitation, but we haven't given it time. Remember that TAT. We need all three in order to effectively temper the chocolate. Now, if we over thicken it by pouring too much out on the table, now we're going to have lumps in our chocolate. And if we overcool it, it's not going to temper properly, and we're going to have bloom in our chocolate. Okay, so time, temperature, agitation, moving it around, usually twice to the table, sometimes 3 times to the table, and then bring it back and just stir it very gently to cool it down and promote that crystal formation. After we have added it back to the bowl, we're going to heat that very gently up to 90 degrees to melt out any unstable forms. Okay, the second method of tempering is called seeding. And really, all of our tempering methods are seeding this chocolate. Whether we're creating the seeds ourselves on the table, where we're creating stable and unstable seeds, or we're adding seed directly to the chocolate, either way, we're seeding that chocolate. So in the seeding method, it's also called the râpé method. And râpé, of course, means grated or ground. So what we do is we heat up our chocolate to 124 degrees. We take 1/3 the weight of the melted chocolate and add that back as râpé, or as tempered chocolate going back into it. And it's very important that our seeds that we're adding to it are fully tempered. We can't add untempered chocolate to melted chocolate and expect it to seed it with the right thing. Just like when we seed our lawn, we would only buy specific grass seed to grow that plant. When we seed our chocolate, we have to have specific chocolate seeds going in order to get the right crystal form. So we've got to have tempered chocolate going in. Heat the chocolate to 124, add in your seeds, which is 1/3 the weight of the melted chocolate. Stir, stir, stir. The heat from the melted chocolate is going to melt the tempered chocolate, and it should come down to 90 degrees. Now, in this method, we don't need to reheat it back to 90 or above because we're not taking it down below 90 degrees. So we're going to add our seed in there, stir it until it comes to 90 degrees, then we're going to test for temper, which we'll talk about in just a minute. We can add seed 2 ways. Now, of course, the râpé method is where we grind up that seed and add it all to the chocolate, stir it, and let it melt. The second way is to use something called the blocking method, which is where we take a block of tempered chocolate and stir it around in that bowl. And both of them have their advantages and their disadvantages. The advantage to seeding or to chipping that chocolate or using the râpé method is that it gets it down to temperature very, very quickly. The problem with this one is that you can overseed it very quickly or very easily, or have your râpé or your ground chocolate very large where it leaves big lumps in your chocolate and you're having to pick those out. The benefit to blocking it is that once it reaches working temperature, you can just remove the big block. The downside of blocking it is now you have some untempered chocolate on the outside of your block. It's difficult to find the blocks, and it takes a little bit longer to get that blocked chocolate down to temperature. But we need to remove the excess seed, otherwise it's going to get very chunky. It's going to get kind of fudgy in the bowl, and we're going to have lumps in our chocolate. So we never exceed our working temperature with either one of them, whether we're tabling it or whether we're seeding it. We always want to hold it at working temperature. If we get above that, the chocolate is going to lose its temper. Okay, it's going to bloom and it's going to just not work out well. It's not going to be stable. Okay, the third method is called incomplete melting, and this is good for really small quantities of chocolate. If I just have to temper a tiny little bit of chocolate, I can use this incomplete melting technique. I can use the microwave for this, but again, in very, very small amounts. We're talking half a cup of chocolate or so. So what I would do is I know that I can take tempered chocolate and take it to 90 degrees and it'll hold and it'll keep its temper. And that's the whole reason behind incomplete melting. Or the whole thought process behind it, is we can take this tempered chocolate, and as long as we don't get it above 90 degrees, it's going to still be tempered chocolate. Okay, so it works in small quantities. In large quantities, it tends to overheat and before you get all of the lumps out of the chocolate. So to do this one, we take fully tempered chocolate, chop it in very, very small pieces, heat it very gently until about 80% of the chocolate is melted. If it's a Form 6 crystal, it can go up to 97 degrees. 90 degrees is safer. Okay, so it might still be a Form 5 crystal. So we stir, 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 and the heat of the chocolate melts the rest of the seed. And as long as the final product doesn't exceed 90 degrees, it still stays tempered. How do we know if it's tempered? This is one of the hardest things we can do. We go through our entire process of tempering, we start working with it, and all of a sudden we realize it's not tempered. So it's very important every time we heat the chocolate, whether we're just warming it back up or whether we're tempering it for the first time, we have to test for temper. Couple ways we can do it. We take our chocolate and thinly spread it over marble, or dip the edge of our palette knife or parchment in there and let it set. See if it has spots, see if it has streaks as it sets, or see if it's nice and glossy and smooth. We can take it, I like to use parchment paper just because it's a little easier to peel it off to see how well your temper looks, but we can take it and just spread it very thinly over the marble and see if it sets, and it'll temper as if we're making chocolate fans or chocolate cigarettes, or we can dip our palette knife in, either way. But we always want to take something and have a very thin coating of chocolate, and within about 2 to 3 minutes, it should go from being a liquid chocolate to being a solid where I can actually peel that off, and if I refrigerate it, it should be able to snap. Okay, it should never bend, it should always snap. But if I have streaks or spots in there, it might just mean that I need to give it more residence time just by holding it at that temperature. If it doesn't set at all, I may need to go through that tempering process again, giving it some more seed and letting it go. So once it's tempered, it's going to be glossy. If I put it on something like acetate or plexiglass, it's going to be really shiny on one side. It's going to be strong. It'll be able to hold up when I'm molding it, dipping something into it. I can build showpieces with it at this point. It's going to be shiny, and of course I can touch it and it won't immediately melt in my hand when it's tempered. Okay, untempered chocolate has a very low melting point. This is the one you touch and it just comes off very sticky in your hand. If I go to snap the chocolate and it just crumbles in my hand, that means it's not tempered correctly, or it can exhibit bloom. Now there's two types of bloom. This is the moldy looking stuff that I was talking about earlier, when you leave the chocolate in your car and then stick it in the refrigerator and it looks moldy. Two types of bloom can exist on the chocolate. One is fat bloom, one is sugar bloom. Now fat bloom occurs when the chocolate has been overheated or not tempered properly to begin with. So fat bloom looks like streaks of white, almost like white mold, streaking across the surface of the chocolate. And what happens is the cocoa butter crystals are unstable and they rise up to the surface of that chocolate as it's setting. So heat or poor temper will cause that, and it can show immediately or it can form as that chocolate sets and is being stored. Usually by the second day, it's very, very obvious if that fat bloom is happening. The second type of bloom is sugar bloom, and this happens under humid circumstances. If water settles on the chocolate, it'll pull the sugar out to the surface of the chocolate. And they're typically round spots. Again, they look kind of white and moldy on the chocolate, but this is actually just sugar crystals forming on the outside, being pulled out of the chocolate and forming on the surface. The best way to tell the difference between the two is to touch the chocolate. Run your finger across the chocolate, and if it feels very gritty, then it's sugar bloom. If it feels smooth, then it's fat bloom. All right, taste testing chocolate. This is one of my favorite things to do. What we want to look for when we're taste testing chocolate is differences in the cacao percentages and differences in the cacao blends. We can have a 60% chocolate, for example, be exactly the same percentage, taste completely different depending on the manufacturer. So when we're creating candies or we're creating different products that we're eating, whether they're cakes, candies, ganaches, all kinds of different things that we do with the chocolate. There is no one right answer as far as what the best chocolate is. Sometimes they'll change year to year. They'll definitely change from manufacturer to manufacturer. But what we can look at are the way that they're blended, the percentages, and the differences in conching between the manufacturers. I may want a very bitter floral chocolate if I'm putting it with a dark berry, okay, depending what I'm doing with it. I may want a very light sweet chocolate if I'm putting it with caramel or something with sea salt or whatever that is. So just like when we pair food and wine, pairing chocolate and food, you have to take all of those little underlying notes and pair them appropriately, depending how they're going to be used. Now, milk chocolate and white chocolate are going to have both cocoa butter and butter fat in them. Dark chocolate should have only cocoa butter in them. Okay, but again, depending what I want to do with it, I'm going to have a different requirement for my chocolate. So as I'm tasting the chocolate, I always want to let my palate be my guide. Don't fall into this idea that only certain chocolates are appropriate for use. Every chocolate has its place. It really depends how we're using that in the final and finished product.